The airport was already busy that morning. People rushed past each other, pulling suitcases, checking boarding passes, and talking into phones. Among them walked a tall man in an expensive gray suit. His shoes shined like glass, and his watch glimmered under the fluorescent lights. He was the kind of man people noticed, not because of his kindness or charm, but because he carried himself with an air of superiority. He was a well-known business figure, a CEO of a major company, and he believed the world ran smoother when people like him were in charge. As he approached the gate, his assistant handed him a coffee and reminded him about his meeting at the other end of the flight. He nodded impatiently and gave only a brief, "I know." He was flying first class, of course. He liked comfort, silence, and order. To him, travel was just another part of his successful routine. When the boarding call was announced, he got up quickly, eager to avoid lines. He disliked waiting, and he disliked crowds even more. He walked confidently to the plane, handing his ticket to the attendant without even looking at her. Inside, the scent of new leather and soft perfume filled the cabin. Everything looked clean and elegant, just the way he liked it. He placed his briefcase in the overhead bin and turned toward his seat. But the moment his eyes landed on the person sitting next to him, his confident expression changed. The man in the next seat was dressed in worn-out jeans and a jacket with dark oil stains on the sleeves. His hands were rough and marked with grease. His face was tanned from long hours of outdoor work, and his nails were blackened from engine dust. He looked tired but content, sipping from a bottle of water and smiling as passengers found their seats. The CEO froze for a second, blinking as if he couldn't believe his eyes. He quickly looked around, then back at the man beside him. "Excuse me," he said to the flight attendant passing by, lowering his voice but not his irritation. "Is there perhaps another seat available? I believe there must be some mistake." The flight attendant checked her tablet politely. "I'm sorry, sir. The flight is completely full today." He frowned, displeased. "Are you sure?" "Yes, sir. I'm afraid there are no other seats left." He sighed heavily, shaking his head in frustration. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll manage." He sat down stiffly, avoiding eye contact with the man beside him. He placed his laptop bag on his lap as though to form a barrier between them. The mechanic, still smiling softly, nodded in a friendly way. "Good morning," he said. The CEO pretended not to hear. He opened his laptop and began typing an email, though his mind was half occupied with irritation. How could a man like him be seated next to a mechanic? The thought bothered him more than he cared to admit. He had worked hard, built his empire, surrounded himself with successful people, and now, on this flight, fate decided to seat him next to someone who smelled faintly of motor oil. The mechanic didn't seem offended. He looked out the window, admiring the sight of the runway, then said softly, "It's a good day to fly. The sky looks clear." The CEO's fingers paused over the keyboard for a moment, then continued typing. He didn't respond. The mechanic gave a small shrug and went back to looking out the window. The plane soon began to taxi. Passengers buckled their seatbelts as the cabin crew went through safety instructions. The CEO barely listened. He had flown so often that he could repeat the safety script himself. As the engines roared to life, he leaned back, closed his eyes, and tried to rest. He preferred silence on flights. Small talk made him uncomfortable, especially with strangers who didn't move in his circles. The aircraft lifted smoothly off the ground, and the city below grew smaller. The CEO opened his eyes and looked out for a moment, admiring the view. But even then, he felt slightly annoyed by the faint smell of machine grease coming from his neighbor's clothes. Half an hour passed. The flight attendants served drinks and snacks. When they offered coffee, the CEO asked for one quickly, while the mechanic ordered plain water. "So," the mechanic said kindly, "are you traveling for work?" The CEO looked up from his laptop, his tone clipped. "Yes, me too," the mechanic said cheerfully. "Been away for 2 weeks fixing engines in a mining town. Finally heading home." "Engines," the CEO repeated almost without interest. "You're a mechanic then?" "Yes, sir. Aircraft and industrial engines mostly. Been doing it for over 20 years. "Interesting," the CEO said flatly. He turned back to his screen, ending the conversation. The mechanic smiled, undisturbed. "You must be in business, right? You look like someone who's always in meetings." The CEO didn't even glance at him. "You could say that." Silence stretched between them. The hum of the engines filled the air. The CEO's fingers tapped against the keyboard. His mind focused on an upcoming deal worth millions. But as the minutes turned into hours, boredom crept in. He closed his laptop and glanced sideways. The mechanic had taken out a small photo from his pocket, an old, slightly faded picture of a family standing near a workshop. He smiled softly at it before tucking it back. "Your family?" the CEO asked, curiosity slipping into his tone before he could stop himself. The mechanic looked at him, surprised that he was speaking now. "Yes, my wife and my son. He's 12. Wants to be an engineer one day?" The CEO nodded, not sure what to say next. For some reason, the man's gentle tone unsettled him. He wasn't used to such calm, unbothered confidence from someone who didn't wear a suit. A little while later, the plane hit turbulence. It shook suddenly and the seatbelt signs came on. The CEO stiffened, gripping the armrest tightly. The mechanic, however, seemed completely calm. "It's just some air pockets," he said. "Happens often when flying over the mountains." The CEO glanced at him nervously. "You sound like you know exactly what's going on." The mechanic smiled. "I've worked on enough planes to recognize the feel. The wings are strong, the engine's steady. Nothing to worry about." Something about the man's certainty eased the CEO's tension. He exhaled slowly. "You said you fix aircraft engines?" "That's right," the mechanic replied. "Mostly jet turbines. They're fascinating machines. You'd be surprised how much they're like people. Need balance, care, and good fuel to keep running smooth." The CEO gave a small, unexpected chuckle. "I never thought of engines as human." "That's because you've never listened to one up close," the mechanic said. "They talk to you in their own way. A good mechanic can hear when something's off. The sound changes a little, like a person catching a cold." The CEO found himself strangely interested. "So you can tell just by listening?" "Most times, yes. The smallest sound can save a plane. You fix it early and you save a life later." The CEO nodded slowly, genuinely impressed now. For the first time on that flight, he looked at the man beside him, not as someone beneath him, but as someone who understood something he didn't. After the turbulence passed, the mechanic leaned back and looked relaxed. The CEO took a sip of his coffee and asked, "You travel a lot for work?" "Quite a bit," the mechanic replied. "Sometimes I'm away from home for weeks. It's not easy, but I love what I do. There's something satisfying about repairing something broken and seeing it come back to life." "That must be tiring," the CEO said. "It is," the mechanic admitted. "But when I come home and my boy runs to the door, it's worth every hour. He says one day he'll build engines better than mine." The CEO gave a faint smile. "Sounds like a good kid." "He is," the mechanic said softly. "I just hope he learns to respect everyone equally. My father always said that people aren't made better by what they wear, but by what they do for others." The CEO looked out the window for a long moment after hearing that. He didn't respond, but something about the words stayed with him. As the flight continued, they began to talk more. Slowly, naturally, the mechanic asked about the CEO's business. The CEO, without realizing, started sharing stories about his early struggles, how he started with nothing but a small idea and turned it into a company. The mechanic listened with genuine interest. "That takes courage," he said. "Starting from the bottom and building your way up, it's the same in my trade. The first time I fixed an engine alone, my hands shook the whole time. But once it roared to life, I felt like I'd done something important." The CEO smiled at that comparison. "Maybe business and mechanics aren't that different after all," he said. "Both require fixing problems and keeping things running." "Exactly," the mechanic agreed. "Just different kinds of tools." Hours passed and the two men shared stories about their lives. One about boardrooms and deadlines, the other about workshops and long nights fixing machines in the rain. The CEO began to notice how content the mechanic sounded when he spoke about his life, even though he clearly didn't have much wealth. That calm confidence made the CEO think of something he hadn't felt in a long time: humility. As the plane started its descent, the CEO found himself oddly grateful for the seat assignment he had once cursed. He had learned more from a mechanic in a few hours than from some of his high-profile meetings. He realized that not all success could be measured in numbers or luxury. Some success lived quietly in people who worked with their hands, who stayed grounded while the rest of the world chased altitude. The announcement for landing echoed through the cabin. Passengers buckled up again, and the mechanic looked out the window with a peaceful smile. The CEO followed his gaze, watching the clouds part as the city lights came into view below. When the wheels touch, The plane had finally landed, and as passengers gathered their belongings, the CEO remained seated for a while, thinking about the conversation he'd just had. He wasn't used to connecting with strangers, especially not someone from such a different world. But something about the mechanic's calm attitude and genuine outlook had stayed with him. It was as if that short flight had quietly shaken up something deep inside him. He gave a polite nod to the mechanic before stepping out of the plane. The man smiled back warmly, wished him a safe trip, and disappeared into the crowd. Outside, the CEO's driver was already waiting with the car door open. The familiar comfort of leather seats and tinted windows greeted him, yet for some reason it didn't feel as satisfying as before. As they drove through the busy city, his mind kept drifting back to the flight. The way the mechanic spoke with quiet pride about his work, his family, his son wanting to be an engineer. Those words kept replaying in his mind. At the hotel, he settled into his suite overlooking the city skyline. It was a perfect view, but instead of admiring it, he found himself thinking about the mechanic's hands. How rough they looked, yet how confidently they moved. Those hands had probably fixed more engines and saved more lives than he could count. He realized that while he spent his days signing contracts and shaking hands in meetings, people like that mechanic were the ones who actually kept the world running. The next morning, he attended his business meeting. The room was filled with executives in dark suits, speaking in sharp tones, discussing profit margins and market expansions. Everything felt familiar, but somehow it all seemed a little hollow. When one of his partners started bragging about cutting costs by replacing older workers with younger, cheaper labor, he found himself frowning. Normally, he would have nodded along. It was good for business. But this time, he thought about that mechanic who had given 20 years of his life to his craft, quietly keeping things safe and working. The thought unsettled him. He didn't say anything right away, but the meeting no longer gave him the thrill it once did. Later that afternoon, while waiting for his next flight home, he sat in the lounge sipping coffee, lost in thought. A television near the corner played the news. There was a report about a small regional airline that had recently been saved from a major engine failure mid-flight. The anchor mentioned that a ground mechanic had spotted the issue earlier that week and prevented what could have been a serious disaster. The CEO couldn't help but smile faintly. People like him never get enough credit, he thought. As he boarded his flight home that evening, he glanced around the cabin, wondering who might sit beside him this time. No one particularly stood out. Still, he caught himself noticing people differently now, not by their clothes or status, but by their expressions, their gestures. He noticed a young mother calming her crying baby, an elderly man carefully folding his boarding pass, a tired-looking flight attendant offering a smile even when she was clearly exhausted. It struck him that everyone around him had their own battles, their own reasons for being there. When he returned to his city, he was greeted by the usual bustle, his assistant handing him schedules, his phone buzzing with unread messages, meetings piling up. He went back to his office, greeted his staff with a polite nod, and tried to slip back into routine. But he couldn't. Something had changed. The mechanic's words echoed in his head. We all have something valuable to offer, no matter what clothes we wear. One evening, as he was reviewing a proposal, his company's operations manager came in with news about a delayed shipment. One of the delivery trucks had broken down on the highway. The CEO frowned, asking what caused it. The manager said they were waiting for a mechanic to come fix it. Without thinking, the CEO asked if the mechanic had been treated well, if he had all the tools he needed. The manager looked surprised. This wasn't the kind of question the CEO usually asked. He simply nodded and said he'd check. That night, the CEO stayed late in his office. The city lights shimmered outside his window and the office floor was quiet. He leaned back in his chair, thinking about how he had always believed power and success came from being above others, from climbing higher. But maybe it wasn't about that. Maybe real strength came from understanding people, respecting their part in the bigger picture. A few days later, he received an invitation to a charity dinner, hosted by one of his old colleagues. It was an event where wealthy business leaders came together to donate money for social causes. He usually attended these things out of obligation rather than interest, but this time he felt different. During the dinner, while others chatted about stocks and investments, he found himself listening to a young woman speaking passionately about a program that provided scholarships for vocational training. She explained that many talented workers never got the chance to study formally, yet their hands and hearts built everything around us. Her words reminded him so much of that mechanic that he decided to fund the program quietly, without announcing his name. It wasn't about publicity anymore. It just felt like the right thing to do. Weeks passed, and he returned to his usual schedule of meetings, reports, and presentations. Yet every now and then, he'd catch himself remembering that conversation on the plane. Sometimes he'd glance out of his office window and think of the people working quietly in factories, on construction sites, in workshops, people he had rarely thought about before. One afternoon, as he was preparing to fly again for another business trip, he checked his seat number and smiled slightly. He wondered who might end up beside him this time. Maybe he'd be lucky enough to meet another unexpected teacher. The next flight was delayed by an hour. Passengers sat restlessly in the lounge, scrolling through their phones or pacing around. The CEO sat quietly, looking out the large glass window at the planes parked outside. He noticed a group of ground staff working in the cold wind, wearing reflective jackets, guiding the aircraft carefully into place. He saw how precise their movements were, how synchronized their teamwork seemed. He felt a quiet respect for them, these people whom most passengers never even noticed. Finally, the flight was ready to board. As he walked down the jet bridge, he noticed something unusual. Maintenance crew members gathered around one of the engines, checking something under the wing. They looked serious but calm. A few minutes later, one of the crew members came on board to speak with the pilot. The pilot nodded, then announced over the speaker that a quick inspection was being done for safety reasons. The passengers groaned at the delay, but the CEO didn't mind. He knew that somewhere among those crew members could be someone like the mechanic he had met, a person who took pride in their work, even if no one thanked them for it. The delay lasted about half an hour. When they finally took off, he couldn't help feeling grateful for the people behind the scenes who made such journeys safe. He looked around and noticed a few passengers complaining about the delay, but he stayed quiet, thinking, if they only knew how much work goes into keeping us all safe. After a few days of meetings in another city, he decided to return home earlier than planned. His assistant was surprised, but he simply said he needed a break. On the flight back, he spent most of the time reflecting. Success had always been his driving force, but lately, it felt empty when it wasn't shared with compassion. When the plane landed, he walked slowly through the airport instead of rushing out like he used to. He noticed a janitor sweeping the floor carefully near a busy escalator. Most people walked past without even looking, but the CEO stopped for a moment and said, "You're doing a great job keeping this place clean." The janitor blinked in surprise, smiled shyly and said, "Thank you, sir. Not many people say that." The CEO nodded and continued walking, feeling lighter somehow. A week later, during a company event, one of his managers brought up an idea to start a new community project. The CEO, who once would have dismissed it as a waste of time, now listened carefully. He approved the plan and suggested they include training programs for technical workers, mechanics, electricians, engineers, people who kept industries alive. He explained that their company should not only sell products, but also invest in people who built the foundation of society. His board members were surprised at his sudden change in perspective, but no one objected. That evening, as the office emptied and the lights dimmed, he sat alone at his desk again. He thought about how strange life could be. One random seat assignment on a plane had changed the way he saw the world. The mechanic probably had no idea that his simple words and quiet wisdom had planted a seed in someone else's mind, a seed that had now begun to grow. He wondered what the mechanic was doing at that moment. Maybe he was back in his workshop, tightening bolts on a jet engine, whistling while he worked. Maybe he was at home with his family, telling his son stories about airplanes. The CEO smiled at the thought. It felt good to imagine that somewhere out there, that man was living happily, unaware of how deeply he had influenced a stranger thousands of feet above the ground. For the first time in years, the CEO felt something that money could never buy: contentment. He realized that respect wasn't about titles, it was about understanding, and that every person, no matter what job they did, deserved to be seen and valued. As he stood by his window that night, watching Dubai, a few months passed and the CEO had quietly changed in ways even his closest employees noticed. He no longer walked through the office with that stiff, unapproachable air. He greeted people now, remembered their names, and sometimes stopped to ask how their families were doing. Some staff members were surprised, even confused at first, but soon they began to smile more when he entered a room. The company itself had started small internal changes too. He had introduced a new program for workers who wanted to learn additional skills. For the first time, technicians, drivers, and even janitorial staff were given chances to attend paid training sessions. It wasn't about charity, it was about fairness. He had realized that real progress wasn't just about growing profits, but about helping others grow too. But even with all these changes, something still lingered in his mind. He couldn't forget the mechanic he met on that flight. Every so often, when he saw an aircraft flying overhead, he would think about that calm, steady voice saying, "We all have something valuable to offer no matter what clothes we wear." He wanted to thank him again somehow, to let him know that their short conversation had changed him deeply. One evening, after finishing a long meeting, he sat in his quiet office as rain tapped softly against the large windows. The city below looked peaceful under the faint orange glow of streetlights. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and thought, "I wonder where that man is now." Without overthinking, he opened his laptop and searched for aviation repair companies around the area where that flight had taken off. He didn't remember the man's full name. He realized he had never even asked. But he remembered the details. 20 years fixing engines, working in mining towns, talking about his son who wanted to be an engineer. Those clues were all he had. It took hours of searching through small workshop listings, reading reviews, and watching videos. Then he came across a local article about a mechanic who had started a small repair workshop after years of field work. The article mentioned how this man had trained young technicians from poor backgrounds, giving them opportunities to learn for free. There was a photo attached, and the moment the CEO saw it, he knew it was him. Same kind face, same gentle smile, same spark of humility in his eyes. Without hesitation, the CEO called the contact number listed. A young voice answered, probably one of the trainees. He introduced himself and asked if he could schedule a visit. The young man on the phone sounded surprised but agreed instantly, saying, "Sir, he'll be so happy to meet someone interested in his work." A few days later, the CEO drove out early in the morning, far from the city skyline, through open countryside and small industrial areas. The workshop was simple, a wide tin-roofed shed with the sound of clanking metal and the smell of oil and grease. Several young men were working under the supervision of the mechanic he remembered so well. When the mechanic saw him stepping out of the car, wearing his polished shoes and crisp suit, he blinked in surprise, then broke into a warm, genuine smile. "Well, this is unexpected," he said. "I never thought I'd see you again." The CEO laughed softly. "I wasn't sure if you'd even remember me." "How could I forget?" The mechanic replied. "That flight was a long one, and I remember good conversations better than most." They shook hands, and this time the CEO noticed how steady and strong that handshake was. The mechanic offered him a stool to sit on near a workbench. Around them, the young apprentices watched quietly, curious why such a well-dressed man had come to their small workshop. The CEO looked around. The workshop was modest, but there was an energy about it, a sense of purpose. Tools hung neatly on the walls, engines were neatly laid out on stands, and the air buzzed with quiet dedication. He could tell the mechanic had built something meaningful here. "So," the mechanic said, wiping his hands on a rag, "what brings you here?" The CEO smiled. "I came to thank you. That day on the plane, you said some things that stayed with me. I didn't realize it then, but they changed how I saw the world. You made me think about the kind of person I was becoming." The mechanic looked thoughtful for a moment, then chuckled. "I didn't say anything special, I think." "You did," the CEO said sincerely. "You spoke with honesty. You reminded me that success without respect doesn't mean much." The mechanic nodded slowly. "I'm glad if something good came out of it." As they spoke, one of the apprentices called out, "Sir, we can't get this valve to fit right." The mechanic excused himself and walked over. The CEO watched as he crouched down beside the young man, explaining patiently, guiding his hands gently until the part fit perfectly. There was no arrogance, no irritation, just quiet pride in teaching. The young man smiled wide with satisfaction, and the mechanic patted his shoulder before returning to the CEO. "You see," the mechanic said, "these kids come from small towns. Most of them couldn't afford formal training. I teach them what I know. In return, they teach me patience every day." The CEO nodded, feeling a deep respect. "You're building something far more valuable than machines here." The mechanic smiled modestly. Maybe. I just try to make sure they understand that skill and kindness can go together. They sat talking for over an hour. The CEO shared how his company had changed since their meeting, how he'd started programs to help workers grow, how he'd learned to see every role in the company as vital. The mechanic listened quietly, occasionally smiling. "That's good to hear," he said. "The world needs more leaders who see people, not just numbers." Before leaving, the CEO looked around again and said, "Would you consider partnering with my company? We've been looking to work with smaller workshops that focus on quality and ethics. You'd keep your independence, but we could help you with resources and reach." The mechanic looked surprised. "I don't know what to say. I never thought anyone like you would want to work with someone like me." The CEO smiled kindly. "Maybe it's time we stopped thinking in terms of someone like me and someone like you. We both build things, just in different ways." They shook hands again, sealing not just a business idea but a connection built on mutual respect. A few weeks later, the mechanic visited the CEO's office in the city. For the first time, the staff saw their boss walk through the halls beside a man in oil-stained clothes, talking as equals. There was something poetic about it. The businessman who once looked down on such people now proudly introducing one as his new partner. In the conference room, the CEO presented the collaboration plan to his board. The board members looked skeptical at first. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if it was wise to work with such a small, unpolished workshop. But as the mechanic began to speak, explaining his experience with engines and his passion for teaching, the room grew quiet. His confidence came not from polished words, but from years of real work, and everyone could feel it. When he finished, there was a brief silence before one of the board members said, "If all partnerships were built on this kind of honesty, the business world would be better off." The CEO smiled proudly. The deal was approved. Months later, the collaboration turned out to be more successful than anyone expected. The mechanic's practical knowledge helped improve the company's machinery efficiency, while the CEO's connections helped the workshop grow into a training center that employed dozens of new workers. It became a partnership built not on greed but on shared values. But more than the success itself, what stood out was how both men continued to learn from each other. The CEO would sometimes visit the workshop, rolling up his sleeves, asking questions about the tools and machines. The mechanic would visit the office occasionally, talking to young managers about the importance of patience and empathy in leadership. They came from two very different worlds, yet they found a common ground of respect. One day, after inspecting a new training wing the company had funded, the CEO stood outside the workshop, watching a group of apprentices laughing and learning under the mechanic's guidance. The sound of metal and laughter mixed in the air. The CEO turned to him and said quietly, "You know, the first time I saw you on that plane, I couldn't stand sitting next to you." The mechanic laughed heartily. "I remember. You looked like you wanted to jump out before takeoff." The CEO smiled. "If someone had told me back then that we'd be here today working together, I'd never have believed it." "Life's full of surprises," the mechanic said. "Sometimes we just need to sit through a little turbulence before we find the right direction." The CEO nodded, thinking how true that was. He looked around at the workshop, the young faces full of hope, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. A quiet, peaceful pride. Not in himself, but in what they had built together. When he drove back to the city that evening, the sky was painted in soft shades of gold and blue. As the car moved along the highway, he saw an airplane soaring high above, leaving a white trail across the sky. He smiled to himself. That one flight had changed everything. Sometimes, a single seat on a plane can become the place where a man finds not just another traveler, but a mirror showing him who he could become if he chose kindness over ego. And from that one moment, a whole new journey can begin. He plane touched down smoothly, and a wave of relief spread across the cabin. People clapped softly, some smiling at each other, others just happy to have reached safely. The CEO sat still for a moment, staring out the window, trying to make sense of what just happened. His heart was still beating faster than usual. The entire flight his mind had been running, and not just about business for once. He kept thinking about how the man beside him, the same man he had judged so quickly, had calmly handled a situation that could have gone very wrong. As passengers started gathering their bags, the mechanic leaned back in his seat and smiled, as if nothing unusual had happened. He didn't seem proud or eager for attention. He looked simply content, like someone who knew the value of staying calm when it mattered most. The CEO turned toward him, hesitating before speaking. It wasn't easy for him to admit when he was wrong, especially to someone he had looked down on. "Hey," he began quietly, his voice lower than before. "I heard the pilot thanking you earlier. You told them about that sound, didn't you?" The mechanic gave a modest shrug. "Yeah, I just noticed something off with the air intake system. It's a habit, I guess. I've worked with engines for so long that I can almost hear when something's not right." The CEO nodded slowly, feeling a mix of respect and guilt. "You might have saved us all. That's impressive." The mechanic chuckled softly. "Well, I don't know about that. It's just experience. I've been doing this my whole life." The CEO looked down at his expensive watch, then back up. "You know, I owe you an apology. When I saw you sit next to me, I judged you. I didn't even try to hide it." He paused for a second, then added honestly, "I was rude, and I'm sorry for that." The mechanic turned to him with a warm, forgiving smile. "You don't owe me anything. People judge all the time. It's natural to assume things based on what we see. What matters is whether we're willing to change what we think once we learn more." The words hit the CEO harder than he expected. They were simple but full of truth. For years he had built walls around himself. Expensive suits, polished shoes, luxury cars, and private offices. He believed those things made him successful, but in that moment, sitting next to this humble man, he realized how small those things really were compared to character and wisdom. As they both stepped off the plane, the flight crew stood near the exit door. The captain shook the mechanic's hand and said, "Sir, we just wanted to thank you again. We checked everything after landing, and you were right. One of the air intakes had a developing issue. It could have caused trouble if left unchecked. You really helped us today?" The mechanic nodded politely, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what anyone would do if they heard something unusual," he said. But everyone knew it wasn't something just anyone could have done. It required sharp instincts and years of experience. When the CEO heard this, he couldn't help but feel another wave of embarrassment. The same man he thought was beneath him had just earned the captain's respect and possibly saved hundreds of lives. It was humbling in a way he had never experienced before. As they entered the airport terminal, the CEO found himself walking beside the mechanic again. He didn't know what to say, but he didn't want to just part ways without showing his gratitude. "You live around here?" he asked. "Not far," the mechanic replied. "Got a small house out near the edge of town. I work with a few airlines doing engine inspections and repairs." "That's a tough job," the CEO said thoughtfully. "A lot of responsibility." "It is," the mechanic said with a nod. "But it's honest work. My father was a mechanic too. He used to tell me, engines don't care who you are or what you wear. They only respond to how much you understand them. Guess that stuck with me." The CEO smiled faintly at that. "That's a good lesson. My father used to talk about success like it was all about power and control. He never mentioned humility." The mechanic looked at him with kind eyes. "Maybe that's something you had to learn your own way." They reached the baggage claim area. People were gathering their suitcases, waving to family, heading off in different directions. The CEO stood quietly for a moment, watching the mechanic lift his worn travel bag, old, faded, but sturdy, just like him. "You know," the CEO said finally, "you taught me something today." The mechanic raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, what's that?" "That respect isn't about money or titles," the CEO replied. "It's about how we treat people and what we learn from them." "You reminded me of that." The mechanic smiled again, genuine and easy. "That's a good takeaway. We all have something valuable to offer, no matter what clothes we wear." The CEO nodded slowly, those words settling deep in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt small in a good way, grounded, human, aware. He reached out and shook the mechanic's hand. It wasn't a quick handshake like the ones he gave at meetings. This one was firm, sincere, filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, "not just for what you did on the plane, but for reminding me what really matters." The mechanic nodded. "You take care, all right? Safe travels." With that, the two men went their separate ways, one heading toward the exit with a worn bag and quiet pride, the other standing still for a moment watching him go, before finally walking toward his limousine waiting outside. When the CEO got into his car, his driver immediately asked, "How was the flight, sir?" The CEO looked out the window. thinking for a long time before answering. "It was undifferent," he said softly. "Eye-opening." As the city lights passed by, he couldn't shake the image of the mechanic, calm, wise, and content with so little. It made him reflect on his own life, his office, his wealth, and the countless times he had dismissed people who didn't fit his image of success. The truth was uncomfortable but freeing. He had been wrong for a long time. That night, in his quiet apartment overlooking the city, he poured himself a drink and sat on the couch. Usually he'd be scrolling through emails or reviewing numbers, but instead he just sat there, thinking about the conversation on the plane. Every word from the mechanic echoed in his head. "We all have something valuable to offer, no matter what clothes we wear." He repeated that line out loud. It sounded simple, yet it carried a power that changed how he saw everything. For years he had looked down on people, waiters, janitors, drivers, even junior employees, believing they were below him. Now he realized how wrong he had been. He thought about how close they all came to disaster on that flight, and how the man he'd looked down on had saved them without hesitation. That kind of bravery didn't come from education or status. It came from heart, experience, and selflessness. He didn't sleep much that night. Instead, he wrote a note to himself and placed it on his desk. "Be better. Be kind. Everyone has value." The next morning, when he arrived at work, his assistant noticed something different about him. He wasn't rushing or barking orders. He greeted people properly, thanked them, and even asked how they were doing. The assistant looked confused but pleasantly surprised. At a team meeting later that day, one of the staff members made a small mistake during a presentation. Normally, the CEO would have criticized them sharply, but this time he paused, took a deep breath, and said, "It's okay. Mistakes happen. Let's figure it out together." The room fell silent for a moment. Everyone exchanged glances, wondering what had caused this change. But deep down, the CEO didn't care what they thought. He knew he had a long way to go, but he was finally starting to change. Later that evening, as he sat in his office, he found himself searching online for something. Not business news or market trends, but information about aviation mechanics. He wanted to understand more about that world, the one he'd never cared about before. And somewhere inside, he hoped to find that man again someday, not to apologize again, but to thank him properly. The lesson stayed with him. Every time he boarded a flight after that, he'd look around at the people sitting near him, the travelers in worn jeans, the tired parents, the quiet workers heading home, and he'd remind himself, you never know who might be sitting next to you. Months had passed since that unforgettable flight. The CEO's life had changed in ways he didn't even realize at first. His company was still growing, but he no longer measured success by profit alone. He measured it by the people around him, by how he treated them, and by the difference his decisions made in their lives. Programs for employees were flourishing, apprentices were being trained, and the culture of his company was slowly transforming. Yet despite all this, he couldn't stop thinking about the mechanic, the man who had quietly taught him more about life in a few hours than most experiences in his years of wealth and power. One afternoon, a package arrived at his office. It was unexpected. Inside was a small note and a brochure from a company he hadn't heard of before. The note read simply, "We may have met before. There's an opportunity to work together that could benefit both our teams. If interested, call the number below." The handwriting was neat but unassuming. The CEO's heart skipped. Could it be him? He glanced at the brochure. It was about an engineering service that focused on aviation safety and training programs for mechanics, exactly the kind of work the mechanic had described on the plane. He called the number immediately. A friendly voice answered and confirmed that it was indeed the mechanic who had sent the package. The CEO felt a strange mix of excitement and humility. Here was the same man who had changed the way he thought about people and success, now offering a chance to work together professionally. A meeting was scheduled. When they met, the mechanic greeted him with that same warm smile. "Good to see you again," he said. "I didn't expect it would come to this, but it seems life has its own plans." The CEO smiled back. "I'm glad it did. I've been hoping to connect with you again." They sat down together and began discussing plans. The mechanic explained how his company had grown from a small workshop into a respected aviation service. They focused on safety, training, and quality work, and now he wanted to expand. The CEO listened carefully. fascinated not just by the technical knowledge but by the integrity behind every decision the mechanic had made. "I want to offer a partnership," the mechanic said. "Your company has resources we could use to grow this work, but I want to maintain independence. We're small, but we care deeply about what we do. If you're interested, we can make this happen together." The CEO leaned back and smiled. "I can't believe this is happening. I never thought our first meeting would lead to something like this. But yes, I'd like to make it work." Over the next few months, the two men worked closely together. The CEO's company provided support for expanding the workshop, purchasing new tools, and establishing a larger training program. In return, the mechanic's expertise improved the CEO's understanding of engineering and operations. He began to appreciate the importance of hands-on experience, the kind that no boardroom or textbook could teach. One day, they were reviewing progress in the new training facility. Young apprentices were learning everything from engine repair to safety inspections. Their faces were full of determination, some smiling nervously, others with quiet confidence. The CEO watched them, amazed at how much they had grown in such a short time. "You see," the mechanic said, noticing his gaze, "these kids have potential. They just needed someone to show them the way. Many would have been overlooked by traditional schools or companies, but when you give them a chance, they can do incredible things." The CEO nodded slowly. "It's humbling. I never thought I'd say this, but I feel like I'm learning more from you than you're learning from me." The mechanic laughed softly. "We all teach and learn in our own way. Sometimes the lessons are the quiet ones, the ones you least expect." Weeks turned into months. The partnership flourished. Both companies benefited, but more importantly, the CEO's life had changed in ways that no contract could measure. He began spending more time listening, observing and appreciating the people around him. Meetings became more collaborative. Decisions were guided not only by profit but by fairness and respect. One evening, after a long day at the training facility, the CEO and the mechanic stood outside, watching the sun set over the city. The sky was painted with orange and pink, and the hum of distant traffic blended with the soft sounds of the workshop. "You know," the CEO said quietly, "I've been thinking about that flight again. I remember how I judged you just by your clothes. I was wrong, and I'm grateful you didn't let that affect how you treated me." The mechanic smiled. "It's easy to judge, especially when you don't know someone. But what matters is what you do after you realize it. You've changed, and that's what counts." The CEO looked thoughtful. "I've learned that humility isn't weakness. It's understanding that everyone has value. And that lesson, it started with you." The mechanic shrugged modestly. "I just tried to be myself. I didn't expect to teach anyone anything." "You did," the CEO said firmly. "You taught me about respect, patience, and seeing the person behind the work. You changed the way I run my company and maybe even the way I live my life." The mechanic looked at him quietly, then said, "I'm glad if that's true. The rest is up to you. Life gives us chances, but it's what we do with them that matters." A few weeks later, the CEO received an unexpected award from an industry organization. It recognized his company for promoting employee development, ethical practices, and innovation. He accepted the award with a quiet pride, but he made sure to mention the mechanic in his speech. He described how one unexpected encounter on a flight had completely changed his perspective, leading to the partnership and inspiring the new programs in his company. The audience listened, some nodding in appreciation, others clearly moved by the story. After the ceremony, a journalist approached him. "It's rare to see someone in your position admit how much they've learned from others, especially someone outside the corporate world." "How did this happen?" The CEO smiled. "Life has a way of teaching us lessons we don't expect. I met someone on a flight, a man who works with his hands, who understands engines and life better than I could ever understand them from an office. He reminded me that respect and humility are more important than titles or money. That changed everything for me." The journalist nodded, intrigued, and asked, "Do you think this will change how business is done?" The CEO thought for a moment. "It already has in my world. And I hope it inspires others. Everyone deserves to be seen for who they are, not what they wear or what they earn. We all have something valuable to offer." Life continued to unfold. The mechanic's workshop grew into a respected training center, employing dozens of young apprentices. The CEO's company thrived with new ethical practices and a culture of respect. Together, They had built something bigger than business, an example of how humility, respect, and genuine care could change lives. One day, as the CEO visited the workshop to check on progress, he watched a young apprentice lift a heavy engine part onto a stand. The boy struggled, and another apprentice rushed to help. The CEO smiled quietly to himself. This was what success really looked like. People working together, helping each other, learning and growing. Not wealth, not power, not status, but real human connection. The mechanic noticed the CEO watching and said, "It's not just about engines. It's about teaching responsibility, patience, and care. If they learn that, everything else will follow." The CEO nodded. "And you've done more than teach them how to fix machines. You've taught me how to see people. That's worth more than anything else." The mechanic smiled, but his eyes reflected humility. We all need teachers. Some just appear in unexpected ways. You never know when someone beside you might change your life. The CEO glanced at him, thinking back to that first flight. How quickly he had judged him. How wrong he had been. And now, years later, he understood something he never would have realized otherwise. Life often places the people we need to learn from right in front of us. And sometimes the lessons come quietly without warning, changing everything in ways we can't predict. As the sun set behind the workshop that evening, painting the sky with soft shades of gold, the CEO felt a sense of peace he had never known. He had wealth, influence, and success, but for the first time, he also had perspective, humility, and gratitude. He understood that true greatness didn't come from looking down on others, but from lifting them up. The mechanic wiped his hands, smiled at a group of apprentices, and looked at the CEO. "You've come a long way," he said softly. The CEO smiled back, feeling a deep sense of respect and friendship. "And it all started with you. You reminded me what really matters, and for that I'll always be grateful." As they walked together through the workshop, the CEO noticed something he had never paid attention to before. The quiet power of people doing meaningful work. The pride in their eyes, the joy in their accomplishments. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't publicized, but it was real, and it mattered far more than anything money could buy. From that day on, the CEO carried the lesson with him wherever he went. Whether in boardrooms, airports, or offices, he remembered to see the value in everyone he met. And in doing so, he not only became a better leader, but also a better human being. Sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected encounter, one quiet person sitting next to you on a flight, to change the course of your life forever. And the CEO would never forget the mechanic who had done exactly that.